Norman Percival Rockwell was born the younger of two brothers in 1894 in New York City, where his father was a manager of a textile company. At the age of 14, and already with an obvious talent for drawing, Rockwell transferred from his high school to the Chase Art School. He then undertook further formal training at the National Academy of Design and ultimately the Art Students League. In 1911, when he was still only 18, he created a series of colour illustrations for a book by Carl H. Claudy titled Tell Me Why: Stories About Mother Nature. It wasn't a runaway success, but it led to him being hired as a staff artist for the Boy Scouts magazine Boy's Life. He produced his first cover illustration in 1913, and within a year he'd been promoted to art editor. A year later, Rockwell illustrated the book Scouting with Daniel Boone by Everett Tomlinson, with a series of images printed in rather poorly defined half-tone monochrome. In 1915, he and his family relocated to New Rochelle, New York. There he befriended the more established illustrator Clyde Forsyth, who helped to get him his first cover commission for the Saturday Evening Post. His duotone illustration was published in 1916 and more followed soon after. And in the same year he illustrated a scouting-themed book, Don Strong of the Wolf Patrol by William Hayliger, with another poorly printed set of half-tone monochromes. It didn't take long before his appearances on the covers of the Post sparked offers of cover work from several other magazines, and the volume of freelance work he was now getting led to him giving up his job at Boy's Life, although he continued to create images for the scouting movement throughout his lifetime. In 1916, Rockwell married his first wife, Irene O'Connor, and in 1917 the USA joined the Allied forces in World War I. He immediately volunteered, but was rejected on the grounds that he was so underweight for his height he was considered unfit for combat. Of course, patriotism and military themes dominated his output at this time, although not exclusively so. And the visual evidence confirmed that he left the condemnation of Germany and any depictions of the harsh realities of battle to others in his magazines and other war-related commissions at the time. His many ongoing cover illustrations for the Post continued to be reproduced as duotones, but he was also now getting plenty of full-colour work from other clients. And in 1920, Rockwell began to take commissions for advertising alongside his magazine work. Among his earliest were press ads for Arrow shirts and interwoven socks, both of which had up to this point been the domain of his major influence and inspiration, Joseph Leyendecker. So throughout the decade he divided his time between his usual magazine work and creating more press advertising and poster designs for high-profile clients. How he made time for this level of productivity and maintenance of high technical and aesthetic standards is a mystery. In the mid-1920s, the Post finally started printing their covers in full colour, and although the earlier duotones had their own aesthetic appeal, it was with the full-colour lithographic process that Rockwell's meticulous painted technique was most at home, and from that point onward all his output would appear in full colour. Rockwell and his first wife divorced in 1930, and he moved briefly to Alhambra, California, as a guest of his old friend Clyde Forsyth. There he met and married Mary Barstow only a few months later, and the couple returned to New York shortly after and set up home in New Rochelle. By this time, Rockwell was undoubtedly at the very top of his profession, and although magazine work would continue to be the mainstay of his career, he also created more advertising work. And in the 1930s, he added Coca-Cola to his list of prestigious clients and produced calendars and other promotional illustrations. Given how prolific Rockwell was in his magazine and advertising commissions, the illustration of books wasn't all that high on his agenda. But in 1936, his illustrated edition of Mark Twain's Adventures of Tom Sawyer and Huckleberry Finn was published, and the book featured a series of exceptionally engaging colour images which vividly brought to life the events and flavour of these classic comedic adventure narratives. The lack of evidence also indicates he was even less inclined to create murals, but in 1937 he completed Yankee Doodle Dandy, which was displayed behind the bar in New Jersey's Nassau Inn Hotel. As the 1940s began, Rockwell was undoubtedly the most popular American illustrator, and his work could be seen just about everywhere across the USA. He also began producing film posters around this time, but this would only be an occasional aspect of his output in the coming years. In 1941, following the bombing of Pearl Harbor, the USA went to war again, and Rockwell's images naturally enough reflected this. He painted many covers for the Post featuring the young male character Willie Gillis, and followed his journey from civilian to proud member of the armed forces. And in 1943 he created a quartet of paintings inspired by a speech by Franklin D. Roosevelt about the 4 freedoms for universal rights. They were first published in the Post, and the originals were subsequently exhibited around the USA to promote the sale of war bonds. Like many other realist painters, Rockwell generally worked from photographs of posed models, including himself and his family and neighbours. But among his iconic wartime images, he also created this illustration for the Post, rather cheekily based on this figure from the Sistine Chapel by Michelangelo. Unfortunately, in 1944, a fire in his studio destroyed numerous original paintings, as well as a large number of irreplaceable historical costumes and props. And without these at his disposal in future, he generally confined the majority of his images to contemporary subjects. Following the end of the war, it was business as usual for Rockwell, and if anything, he increased the volume of advertising work he was producing. In 1947, he produced the first in a long series of highly popular calendars based on the 4 seasons for the publishers Brown and Bigelow. And his resolutely good-natured images continued to be published in large numbers across the USA. Children were a particularly popular subject in his work, and in 1952 his illustrations were used for the books A Day in the Life of a Girl and A Day in the Life of a Boy, both written by Will Latch. But all was far from well in his personal life, and in 1953 the Rockwells moved to Stockbridge, Massachusetts, so that his wife could be treated at the nearby psychiatric hospital. I don't know the details of this misfortune, but apparently Rockwell himself was also receiving psychiatric treatment during this period. But you would have never known anything was amiss from the volume and relentlessly good-natured tone of his painted images throughout the 1950s. Children featured again in both his 1955 campaign for Kellogg Cornflakes and a remarkably similar campaign for Crest toothpaste only a few years later. Whatever personal problems he was facing at the time, it was never even hinted at in his illustrations. Tragically, in 1959, his wife Mary died unexpectedly of a heart attack, and Rockwell took time off from his work to grieve. But during this break from commercial activity, he and his son Thomas collaborated on his autobiography, My Adventures as an Illustrator. Rockwell married his 3rd wife, Molly Punderson, in 1961, and he returned to illustration work for the Post and yet more press ad campaigns. But his 1963 portrait of John F. Kennedy was his last Post cover, marking the end of a relationship which had lasted 47 years. He then began creating illustrations for Look magazine, and although during the entirety of his career so far, black people had made almost no appearances in his work, in 1964 he painted this now iconic illustration of the young girl Ruby Bridges, protected by federal marshals walking to school past a wall defaced by racist graffiti. And he tackled the subject of race and the civil rights movement several more times in the pages of Look with considerable visual eloquence. But this wasn't the only aspect of his work for the magazine, and he also created illustrations highlighting the USA's space program, among other subjects. Other than his work for Look and some infrequent advertising work, portraiture was by now a dominant factor in Rockwell's output. In 1966, he was invited to Hollywood to paint portraits of the various stars featured in the film Stagecoach. And although most of his subjects were major mainstream figures and leading politicians, in 1968 he was persuaded to create this album cover for rock musicians Mike Bloomfield and Al Kooper. In 1969, the children's book Willie Was Different was published, and it had been co-authored with his wife Molly and illustrated throughout by Rockwell. And although the results were highly engaging, this late-in-life shifting career was the only example of him actually writing something he also illustrated. More portraits were produced into the 1970s for celebrities and politicians, but by this point he had all but retired from published illustration. Nevertheless, he painted his last Boy Scouts calendar in 1976, deliberately based on this iconic painting by Archibald Willard. And in the same year he created this self-portrait for the cover of the magazine American Artist. And following a phenomenally successful and prolific career lasting 65 years and the production of more than 4,000 illustrations, Norman Rockwell died in 1978 at the age of 84 at his home in Stockbridge. In his lifetime, Rockwell's work had been largely ignored or condemned by art critics, largely due to the inherently sentimental nature of his work. Whether this bothered him or not isn't recorded to the best of my knowledge, but it is known that he steadfastly and accurately called himself an illustrator rather than an artist, which seems to indicate he didn't much care what the art elites thought of his work. In an interview about his approach to illustration, Rockwell said, "I unconsciously decided that it wasn't an ideal world, it should be, and so I only painted the ideal aspects of it." And ironically, his painted originals now fetch positively astronomical prices, and much of his work hangs in various museums and continues to attract admiration from those who are lucky enough to view it. The influence and importance of Rockwell in the history of illustration can't be overstated. His effective historical record of life in the USA in the 20th century, however relentlessly non-confrontational, stands as a major testament to the skill of an illustrator who, unlike many others I've covered in the series, needs no help at all from me to be remembered.